The crate was in the wrong bay, that was the first thing Darren Holt noticed when he came in for his late shift in Oran. Bay 14 was supposed to hold processed grain shipments bound for the outer colonies, instead a single black container sat in the far corner sealed with biohazard locks that did not belong anywhere near food cargo. It was roughly the size of a ground transport vehicle. The manifest tag on the side read inert. Mineral samples Sector 7 retrieval. Darren had worked cargo on Oran 9 for 6 years. He knew what mineral samples looked like. They did not breathe, but something in that crate did that. He heard it when he walked past a slow low sound somewhere between a rumble and an exhale, not mechanical, not a pressure valve. Something with lungs was making that sound, and whatever it was big. That he filed a report with his shift supervisor, a tall I named Goss, who had attention span of a broken scanner. Goss looked at the manifest, saw the word mineral, and told Darren to move it to the holding queue and stop wasting his time. Darren moved it to the holding queue. He did not stop thinking about it. That he finished his shift, he clocked out. He went to the crew corridor, sat in his bunk, and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours. Breck, his bunkmate, snored through the whole thing without moving once. That till the 3rd hour, Darren got up, pulled on his work jacket, and went back to Bay 14. To station was quieter this hour. The main cargo lanes were empty. The overhead lights in the lower bays ran at half power during the off shift, which gave everything a dim yellowish look, like the inside of something old. Darren's boots were quiet on the floor. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, and stopped in front of the black container. That he listened. The breathing was still there, slower now, more labored. There was a faint metallic smell underneath the usual cargo bay. Odors of fuel and recycled air. He recognized it after a moment. It was blood, dried and old. He walked the perimeter of the crate. On the left side near the base, one of the off-the-ceiling panels had a thin crack running along its edge, not all open, but enough to let air in and out. That explained how whatever was inside was still alive. He crouched down in front of the crack and looked in. Darkness, then slowly something shifted in the dark, a shape, massive armored plating that caught the faint light and gave it back in dull gray. And then, from the deepest part of the shadow, 2 eyes opened, amber bright as lanterns, focused entirely on him. Darren did not move. The eyes did not move either. He'd seen pictures of Vethkai in the station's public database. He had seen them in a way most people saw dangerous things quickly, from a safe distance, as a category rather than a creature. Apex predator. Death world native. Do not approach. The pictures had not captured the eyes. The pictures had made them look like monsters. The eyes looking at him now looked like something that had been afraid for a very long time. And it stopped expecting anything to change. That he reached into his jacket pocket. He always carried a protein ration on night shifts. Force of habit, he pulled it out, broke it open along the seal, and pushed it through the crack. That a long silence, then the food was gone. But he stayed crouched there for another few minutes, not speaking, not moving. The amber eyes stayed on him the whole time. At some point the breathing changed, still heavy, still tired, but slightly different, like something that had been holding itself tight had let go by a small degree. Darren stood up. His knees ached from the crouch, but he looked at the crate for a moment, then looked at the manifest tag again. Inert mineral Samples Sector 734, weight listed at 400 kg. He did the math quietly in his head. A juvenile Vethkai if these eyes. Through the crack was any guide, young enough to still be growing, old enough to be worth a great deal of money too. Someone who did not care how it had been obtained. He walked back toward the crew corridor. He did not go to sleep. He sat on his bunk and thought about the eyes, not the teeth, not the armor plating, not the threat assessment the database had attached to every line about the Vethkai species, just the eyes, the way they had looked at him through the dark, that he had grown up in a place where things looked at you like that when they had been hurt enough times to stop trusting that help was coming. He knew that look. He had warned himself once, a long time ago, he would go back tomorrow night with more food. He did not make a plan. Beyond that, plans had a way of falling apart on Orin 9. Small decisions were more reliable. Outside the porthole above his bunk, the stars did not move. The station turned slowly in the dark, carrying its freight and its people and its secrets, same as always at I in Bay 14. A Vethkai juvenile pressed her nose against the crack in the crate wall and breathed in the fading scent of the one creature on the station who had stopped walking when he heard her. She did not know what to make of that yet. She would figure it out. The database entry on the Vethka was 37 pages long. Darren read all of it on his lunch break, sitting in the corner of the crew mess with a cold cup of station coffee and the kind of focus, quiet that made people assume he was doing something boring. Nobody bothered him. Nobody usually did. The first 20 pages were military assessments, threat levels, confirmed kill counts from 3 separate colony incidents, recommended response protocols, which were essentially variations of the same advice: do not engage, do not attempt communication, evacuate and contain. One section was titled Known Weaknesses and had only 2 entries. The first was extreme cold. The second said none confirmed in active field scenarios. The next 10 pages were biological data: size ranges, venom composition, sensory capability. The Vethkai could track heat signatures through solid walls up to 12 m away. They had 3 sets of eyelids, which meant they could see in almost total darkness. Their armored plating was dense enough to stop standard issue station security rounds. It was the last 7 pages that Darren read 3 times. They were not a military assessment. They were a behavioral study filed by a xenobiologist named Dr. Sarah Owen, who had spent 4 years observing a Vethkai pack on Veth Prime from a safe distance. The study was dry and technical, and most people would have stopped reading it inside of 2 paragraphs. Darren read every word. Vethkai were not solitary. That was the central finding, stated plainly in the opening paragraph. They were pack animals in the deepest sense, not just cooperative hunters, but genuinely social creatures who formed bonds that lasted their entire lives. A Vethkai raised in isolation did not simply become aggressive. It became something worse than aggressive. It became lost. The rage that made them so feared in containment situations was not their nature. It was what happened when their nature was taken away. A bonded Vethkai, Dr. Owen noted in her conclusion, was a fundamentally different creature from an isolated one. Calmer, more deliberate, capable of extraordinary restraint in situations that would have sent an isolated specimen into a killing fury. She had Watched one sit completely still for 6 hours while a wounded packmate slept against its side. Darren closed the file. He drank his cold coffee. He thought about the amber eyes in the dark and the way the breathing had changed after he pushed the food through the crack. That small release, that small letting go. She had not eaten in a long time. He was sure of that now. And she had been alone for even longer. Breck dropped a meal tray across the table from him and sat down with energy of someone who had opinions and intended to share them. You look like you're solving the galaxy's problems again, he said, reading. Darren said, about what? Vethkai. Breck stopped chewing. He stared at Darren with the expression of a person who was not sure if they had heard correctly. Then he decided they had. Why in the name of anything would you spend your lunch reading about Vethkai? Curious. Curious? Breck repeated the word like it was in a foreign language. Darren, those things eat Drathic for breakfast. The military lost an entire armored unit on Veth Prime in under 4 minutes. 4 minutes? You want to be curious about something, be curious about something. That won't remove your head. Darren nodded slowly. They're pack animals, he said, very social. Isolation makes them dangerous. Everything about them makes them dangerous. Not everything. Breck ate his lunch and stopped asking questions. He had learned over 2 years of sharing a bunk room with Darren that certain conversations had already ended before they appeared to begin. That night Darren went back to Bay 14 with 2 protein rations and a small container of water with a flexible tube he had borrowed from the medical supply closet, which he told himself he would return before anyone noticed. He pushed the water tube through the crack first. He heard it hit the floor inside. Then he heard the slow drag of something very large moving toward it, then quiet, then the sound of water being consumed. That he pushed the food through after. While she ate, he talked, not about anything important, about the station, about the cargo manifest he had processed that day, about the weird smell that had been coming from the ventilation in corridor 4 for 3 weeks, and that maintenance kept promising to fix. He talked the way he used to talk to stray animals when he was a kid, not expecting a response, just offering the sound of a voice that meant no harm. He was midway through explaining the ventilation problem when amber eyes appeared in the crack again, closer this time, close enough that he could see the texture of the armor plating around her brow, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath through the gap. She was looking at him with something that was not hunger and was not fear. He did not have a word for it yet. He kept talking. When he finally stood to leave, she made a sound he had not heard before, low. Not a growl, something softer than that. It lasted only a second, then she was quiet. He walked back to the crew corridor. Behind him in the dark of Bay 14, Vora lay with her head near the crack in the crate wall and breathed the air of station that had, until very recently, held nothing worth breathing. Slowly, for the transfer order was buried inside a corrupted freight log that Darren was not supposed to be reading. He had been looking for a misfiled coolant invoice, that was all. A routine paperwork fix on a slow afternoon, the kind of task that got handed to whoever was nearby and looked like they had nothing better to do. He had pulled up the cargo database, started sorting through the backlog, and there it was, a partially corrupted manifest with a delivery destination that did not match any legitimate trade route he had ever seen. he cleaned up the corruption line by line, the way he had taught himself years ago, because the station's admin software was old and nobody else wanted to learn how to fix it. The more he cleaned, the clearer it became. The black container in Bay 14. Biological asset, live category 4-2. Buyer listed under a shell registry. Destination, a private leisure platform. In the Devaney system, registered to someone with enough money to buy things that were not supposed to be for sale. Transfer window, for days that he sat with that information for a long time. The office around him was quiet. Ventilation fan turned above his head. Outside the small window, the cargo lane was empty. 4 days, he filed a formal complaint through the station's internal system. The system acknowledged receipt and told him a supervisor would review it within 5 to 7 working days. He filed an external report with the Interspecies Wildlife Authority. An automated response informed him that formal inquiries required a minimum processing window of 6 to 8 standard weeks. He tried to reach Commander Sellers' office directly. He got as far as Sellers' assistant, who took his name and told him someone would be in touch. Nobody was in touch. Breck found him sitting in the corridor outside Bay 14 that evening, staring at the floor. Breck sat down beside him without being asked, which was unusual. He did not say anything for a minute. Then he said, "Whatever you were doing, Darren, you need to stop. I filed reports. I know I heard Goss is annoyed. Sellers' office flagged your account for review." Breck looked at him steadily. "You're going to lose your post over a crate of minerals." "It's not minerals." "I know it's not minerals." Breck said it quietly. "That's the problem. Things that aren't minerals and aren't supposed to be here have people behind them. People who don't like questions." Darren looked at the bay door. "Transfer window is 4 days." Breck was quiet for a moment, then he stood up, looked down at Darren and said, "I did not have this conversation with you." He walked away. Darren sat there a while longer, then he went inside. Maintenance override code he used belonged to a ventilation inspection protocol for Bay 12. Bay 14 shared the same system panel. Technically, the code was valid. Technically, it was also being used in a way that its original purpose had not intended. He did not spend too long thinking about the difference. The seal on the crate took 4 minutes to disengage. The panel door swung open slowly, and the smell hit him before he saw her. Blood and metal and something wild underneath, like an open field on a planet with weather. He stepped inside and stopped. She was larger than he had understood from looking through the crack. Even curled as she was, her body filled most of the container. The chains were thick, designed for heavy industrial use, not for an animal, and they had been fastened too tight, too long. The skin beneath 2 of the chain points was raw and infected. Dark fluid dried along the edges. She looked at him, but he looked at her, but he moved slowly. He crouched low, making himself smaller, and opened the field med kit he had brought, a human kit built for human injuries. Completely wrong for what he was dealing with. He knew that. He used it anyway, because it was what he had. That he talked while he worked, the same way as always, steady, low, about nothing particular. He cleaned the infected areas as well as he could with what the kit held. She did not move. She held completely still, with the concentration of a creature that understood on some level what he was trying to do and had decided to allow it. Once when he pressed too firmly on a raw patch, she pulled in a sharp breath and he felt the air move. He stopped, he waited, he said sorry. She exhaled slowly. He continued. When he finished, he sat back and looked at her properly for the first time, not through a crack, not in the dark. She was looking back at him with those amber eyes that took in everything and gave nothing away except the fact that she was paying very close attention. For days, he said, mostly to himself, he had no plan. He had reports that were going nowhere and a transfer window that would not wait for bureaucracy to finish yawning. What he had was aimed kid, a maintenance override code, and the knowledge that the security cameras in this corridor had a dead angle that the maintenance crew had been promising to fix for 5 months. He had 4 days and a very small set of options that he chose the one that did not involve walking away. Storage compartment 7C had not been on the active manifest for 11 months. That it had been flagged for structural inspection after a minor coolant leak. The inspection had been scheduled and then the inspector had transferred to another station and the replacement had a full queue, and somewhere in the slow machinery of 9's administrative backlog, 7C had simply stopped existing. On paper, the lights still worked. Ventilation still are in that it was just empty officially, in the way that things on old stations were sometimes officially one thing and actually another. Darren had known about it for 2 years. He had never needed it until now. Moving Vora was the hardest thing he had done in a long time, not because she resisted. She did not resist. She followed him out of the crate and into a corridor with a kind of careful, deliberate patience that made her look almost graceful, which was a strange word for something her size. The hard part was the logistics of moving a creature that long through service corridors designed for cargo loaders and small maintenance bots at an hour when most of the station was sleeping, without making a sound that would carry through the ventilation to wherever the wrong ears happened to be. EIT took 40 minutes. When they reached 7C, Vora walked inside, turned once, laid down, and looked at him. He brought water and food in after her. She ate. He rerouted the compartment off the active scan network using a trick he had learned from a dock worker named Oren, who had left the station years ago and probably never knew his trick was still being used. The next morning, Darren carried a second load of food rations toward the lower level. He'd been trading his own meal credits, a few at a time, so no single transaction would look unusual. His arms were full. He turned a corner and nearly walked into Fenny's. Fenny's was a large amphibian with gray-green skin and the slow, steady manner of someone who had seen enough of the galaxy to stop being surprised by most of it. He looked at Darren. He looked at the crates. He looked at the direction Darren had been heading. That is a lot of food for one person, Fenny's said. Hungry shift, Darren said. Fenny's looked at him for a long moment with the patient expression of someone who was deciding how much they wanted to know. Then he picked up half the crates without a word and gestured with his head for Darren to lead the way. Darren led the way. When Fenny saw Vora, he stopped in the doorway. His coloring shifted slightly, the way amphibians sometimes did when their nervous system had information it had not yet passed to their brain. Vora looked at him from across the compartment. She did not move. She looked at Darren, then she looked back at Fenny's, and in the low Soft sound she had begun to make when Darren arrived each time, not a threat. Something else. Phineas put the crates down slowly. How, he said. I just kept showing up. Darren said, all found out 2 days later. All was a small avian with bright eyes and an unfortunate habit of noticing things that were not his business. He saw Darren going into the lower level at an odd hour, followed him out of pure curiosity, and ended up standing in the doorway of 7C with feathers very flat against his body, while HFY watched him from 6M away. I'm going to pretend, All said carefully, that I have not seen this. That's fine, Darren said. 0.2 hours later, All came back with extra food, rations he had collected from somewhere Darren decided not to ask about, and the three of them sat in the compartment while Vora ate and watched them all with a calm attention that felt less like assessment now and more like simple awareness. She knew them. She was keeping track of who belonged. It was on the 4th day that one of the poachers found Darren. He had been on his way back from Vora's compartment, hands empty, walking the long route back to the crew corridor. The Drotha stepped out of a side passage and filled the corridor the way large creatures fill small spaces, completely with intention. It was a species Darren knew by reputation. Heavy built, aggressive, not interested in conversation. This one was interested in one conversation specifically. Cargo went missing, the Drotha said. Its voice was low and flat. 400 kilos of cargo. You work this level, I work all the levels, Darren said. Then you know things. I know a lot of things. Drotha took one step forward. Darren did not step back. From the shadow behind Darren's left shoulder, something moved. That it was not loud. It was barely a sound, just a shift of armored plating. Gag against the floor, the soft weight of something very large settling into a new position. The Drotha's eyes moved past Aaron. They went very still. Every part of the Drotha that had been moving forward stopped. Vora had followed him. She did this sometimes now. He had not heard her. She had not wanted to be heard until she wanted to be heard. She did not growl. She did not lunge. She simply stood behind Aaron and looked at the Drotha with amber eyes that caught the corridor light and gave it back like two steady flames. The Drotha looked at those eyes for about 3 seconds. Then it left. Aaron waited until the footsteps were gone. Then he turned and looked at Vora. She looked back at him. He said, you cannot keep following me. After off the corridors, she held his gaze with the calm certainty of a creature that had already decided how things were going to be. That he said, he walked back towards 7C. She walked beside him, matching his pace, her shoulder at the level of his ear, enormous and quiet and completely sure of where she was going, that he was hers. Now she had decided. He was starting to think the feeling was mutual. The complaint the poachers filed was careful and specific and completely without any detail that would reveal what they were actually looking for. That it cited unauthorized removal of bonded freight assets and interference with a registered commercial transfer. It did not say HFY. It did not say live cargo. It used the language of people who moved illegal things for a living and had learned to speak about them without ever naming them. Commander Celera read the complaint at her desk, noted the registry numbers, cross-referenced the bay logs, and dispatched 4 security officers to investigate. She was efficient. She was not particularly curious. There was 2 Much cargo moving through Oran 9 on any given day for curiosity to be practical. Tool, the station went to low alert at the third hour of the work shift. Darren heard on the overhead channel while he was pretending to run a routine check on the cargo loaders in Bay 9. The announcement was brief and bureaucratic. Security sweep lower levels, personnel. Please cooperate with officers, standard language. Most people ignored it. Darren walked to the nearest panel and pulled up the security sweep route that he had access to this because he had access to almost every maintenance and logistics system on the station because nobody had thought to restrict access for a cargo handler who had never caused trouble in 6 years. He looked at the route. He looked at the estimated time. He looked at the current location of the officers. Thought he had maybe 12 minutes. He found Ole near the loader bay and told him quietly that there was going to be a sweep through Corridor 7. Ole understood immediately. He walked directly to Corridor 7, found a pipe coupling that was perfectly fine and began making distress sounds about it and waving down every officer he could find. He was very convincing. Finney sealed off the access point at the lower junction by triggering a manual pressure warning on a coolant line that did not actually have a pressure problem. This required physical access to a panel that was not his assignment. He did it anyway. Between the two of them, they brought Darren closer to 18 minutes. He used all of them when he reached 7C. Vora was already aware that something had changed. She was standing all 6 limbs settled in a low, ready position. Her head turned toward the door. The station had different sounds now, more foot traffic, different patterns, and she tracked those sounds the way her species tracked prey with her whole body. Darren closed the door behind him and sat down on the floor. Vora looked at him. He said, "We are not running." He said it quietly and clearly. "You could not. I know you could. You could go through that wall if you wanted to, but we're not running. We're going to sit here and we're going to let this happen. And we're going to be all right." She held his gaze. He held hers. He was not sure how much of his words she understood in any literal sense. He was fairly sure she understood all of it in the way that mattered. She lowered herself to the floor beside him, not curled up, not relaxed, still alert, still tracking, but beside him, her shoulder pressed against his side. He was briefly aware of how absurd this was. One human sitting on the floor of a station storage compartment leaned against a Vethkai. Then the absurdity passed, and it was just where he was. The security officers found the compartment 17 minutes into the sweep. The door opened. 2 officers came in, standard formation, one with Askiner and one with a hand on his sidearm. They stopped. The scanner beeped once, registering the heat signature that had been sent offline, and then the officer holding it did not appear to hear it anymore. Darren Holt sat on the floor of compartment 7C with a Vethkai pressed against his left side. Bora looked at the officers over the top of Darren's shed with amber eyes that did not blink. She was not growling. She was not lunging. She was doing something that the officers' training had not prepared them for, which was simply looking at them with a total and complete certainty of a creature that had already assessed the situation and made its decisions. Nobody moved. The younger officer's hand drifted away from his sidearm very slowly, as if his body had made that decision without consulting him. The Other officers spoke into his communicator. Commander, you need Tokum. To 7C, Commander Selra arrived 4 minutes later. She stood in the doorway and took in the scene with the expression of someone whose understanding of how the day was supposed to go had just been fundamentally revised. She looked at the Vethkai. She looked at the human. She looked at the way the Vethkai's attention sharpened when Selra took a step forward, not into aggression but into something very close to it, and she stopped taking steps forward. This is impossible, she said. Darren looked up at her. He was tired. He had been tired for days. She just needed someone to be decent to her, he said. The silence in the compartment lasted a long time. Vora breathed steadily. The officers stayed near the door. Commander Selra looked at the two of them on the floor and tried to fit what she was seeing into any category she had for how the world worked. She could not find the right category. Somewhere in the back of her mind, something that might have been the beginning of a new understanding was trying to form. She did not know what to do with it yet. She was, for perhaps the first time in 11 years, fronting Ornine, genuinely uncertain what to do next. She stood in the doorway of the compartment and thought that perhaps she had been writing the wrong things in her threat assessments all along. Interspecies Wildlife Authority ship docked at Orin 9, 31 hours after Commander Selra sent her flag. She had sent it not because she wanted to, but because she had watched the security footage from compartment 7C 17 times and could not find a version of it that fit inside the station's standard response procedures. That a Vethkai was on her station. A human cargo handler had apparently befriended it. Standard procedures had nothing to say about this, so she escalated it, labeled it an active Vethkai containment event, and attached the footage. The footage was why the IWA ship arrived in 31 hours instead of the 6 to 8 standard weeks their automated system had quoted. Darren, it was also why by the time the ship docked, the footage had spread to 14 galactic news feeds, 3 independent broadcast networks, and 1 very popular public channel on the collective information web that translated into 9 languages in under 2 hours. Darren did not know any of this. He was in the crew mess eating a real meal for the first time in 4 days when All found him and told him. Mito found the whole thing funny in the way small avians sometimes found large situations funny, with bright eyes and a tilt of the head that suggested the universe had finally done something interesting. Fenny, sitting beside him, mostly looked relieved. The poachers were arrested before the IWA team had finished docking. Sierra had held them in station custody from the moment she understood what she was actually looking at in those manifests. The operation was larger than anyone on Orin 9 had known. 3 other stations, at least 12 other animals moved in the past year. The IW team's investigator, a tall toller with tired eyes and a manner of someone who had seen exactly this kind of thing too many times, called it one of the cleaner cases they had cracked in years. She said it without any pleasure. The question of Vora took longer. The IWA team approached her with standard containment protocol, a reasonable decision made by people who dealt with dangerous wildlife and had procedures that existed for good reasons. Vora did not cooperate with the procedure. She sat in the corner of 7C and watched the team with the patient stillness of a creature that had already decided which Beings on this station mattered and was not interested in revising that list. Under pressure, they called Darren. He came in, sat down on the floor, and Vora pressed the side of her jaw against his shoulder in a Vethkai gesture that Dr. All studied had noted meant something. Close to this one is safe. The IWA team took their readings and did their assessments with Vora watching them from a position of total calm. The officer wrote things in her notes for a long time. Afterwards, she found Darren in the corridor and asked him how he had done it. He thought about it for a moment. He said he had not done much. He had just shown up every night and not asked anything from her. The officer wrote that down too. The question of what happened next was the hard one. Vora could not bear returns to Veth Prime. She had been in captivity too long, and reintegration failure rate for isolated Vethkai was, the officer explained carefully, close to total. She would not be accepted by a wild pack. She would almost certainly not survive the attempt. She had, however, already formed a pack. The data was clear on this. The behavioral indicators were unambiguous. The officer listed them in the report in the dry, technical language of someone translating an obvious truth into bureaucratic terms. Subject has demonstrated full bonding behavior toward primary contact and to secondary contacts. Subject responds to primary contact exclusively. Aggression indicators absent in bonded context. IWA created a new provisional category. It had a long official name. What it meant in practical terms was that Vora would remain on Orin 9 under protected status, with Darren listed as her primary contact and responsible party. The paperwork was, everyone agreed, extraordinary. Sarah signed 17 forms. Darren signed 9. All and Finney's were listed as secondary contacts and seemed to feel differently about this. Finney's was calm about it. All looked quietly thrilled. Breck watched all of it from the edge of the cargo bay where the IWA team had set up their processing station. He did not say much. He was not a person who went quiet often, and when he did, it usually meant something had genuinely reached him. At the end of the day, when most of the team had moved on, he found Darren and stood next to him for a moment. "I didn't think I was going to work," he said. Darren said, "Neither did she at first." Breck nodded slowly. He walked away. That was the end of it. Down on the observation deck of Orin 9 in the late hours, when the cargo lanes were quiet in the station, moved in its slow orbit. Darren sat with his back against the curved wall, and Vora curled around him in a resting posture that the behavioral study had described as a pack protection position, which translated loosely as, "This one is mine, he is safe, and anyone who disagrees is welcome to have that conversation with me." The news feeds ran the footage for weeks. Commentators across dozens of species tried to explain it, analyze it, categorize it. Most of them focused in the wrong things. They focused on the danger, on the impossibility, on what it meant for containment protocols and wildlife classifications. The comment that spread furthest across the feeds, translated, reshared, quoted in languages Darren had never heard of, came from a Veth K behavioral researcher on Veth Prime who had spent 30 years studying the species in the wild. She watched the footage once, then she wrote in here native script a single sentence that her colleagues translated as, "We did not know humans could do that." She meant the kindness, the specific, stubborn, inconvenient kind that sat in The dark with something frightened and did not leave and did not ask for anything back. The galaxy had spent centuries cataloging humanity's wars, its weapons, its survival rates on hostile worlds, its frustrating refusal to stay dead when the odds said it. Should it had not thought to measure what humans did in the quiet, in the dark, when nobody was watching, and there was no reward for staying down on the observation deck. Vor's breathing slowed into sleep. Darren stayed still and watched the stars and did not feel like he had done anything remarkable at all. That perhaps was the most remarkable thing.